for that, and keep an eye out for our next solar eclipse. That will be April 8th of 2024. Here in Tennessee, we'll be at about 85% totality, so maybe we'll do a little FreightWave special on that. Right now, for today's Roundtable, we're going to take a look at what's going on in Washington, and things are going on in Washington for sure. And so here to join us, we've got Loren Smith to talk a little bit about what's going on and some of the updates across the area there. Loren, thank you for being here on this Tuesday.
Kaylee.
So, of course, all eyes on Washington right now for one big reason, and that is the continuing turmoil in the House of Representatives. We saw, of course, the ousting of the Speaker of the House about 2 weeks ago in an unsuccessful attempt to get someone in. Now you've got Representative Jim Jordan for his bid to become Speaker, and everybody's wondering, what does this mean for the future of the House and what it's going to be capable of doing? How does this have a potential to impact freight if we don't get a Speaker in and we can't make any progress?
Well, I think that if they're not able to get a speaker in the next couple of weeks, I think it starts to get tricky because November 17th is the backstop deadline for the next appropriations round. The fiscal year 2024 appropriations are sort of overdue at this point, but Congress passed a continuing resolution at the end of the fiscal year to give Congress that extra 7 weeks to get something done. But that time has been entirely consumed by what's going on the House floor. I do think at this point that Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio is probably going to get the votes that he needs to become Speaker. I think the outlines of a deal on spending, particularly defense spending, seems to be the thing that might get the last few holdouts there. But again, if he gets in, we can look at something approaching regular order where they may have a deal in place or they may be able to get to a deal on spending for the next fiscal year, including infrastructure funding. But you asked the right question. If they don't get a deal done, we could be looking at another government shutdown by mid-November.
And of course, the last time that we were on the heels of government shutdown, it feels like it was just yesterday, and it was about 2.5 weeks ago when we, again, made that extension for the government to get something done, hopefully. And we kind of had that roundtable discussion where we were looking at what a government shutdown meant for freight. And really, a lot of it kind of boiled down to maybe some limitations with Customs and Border Protection, limitations on the ability of goods to be imported, just because of the fact that we're not going to have the ability to staff people to check their imports, things like that. Is that something that we could be looking at again going forward as a threat of if the government shutdown were to happen again? I believe, as you mentioned, November 17th, so we're exactly a month away from that happening right now. Plenty of time, but should shippers maybe start looking at preparing for that right now, since it will be right in the middle of peak season?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there have been past shutdowns where it was only partial because Congress had been able to pass some of the appropriations bills, whether it was military construction or the Department of Homeland Security, and then you had other agencies that were going unfunded. In this case, it's still the case that all of the funding needs to be sorted out for next year, and so all of those factors that we were discussing last month, as far as border inspections and all of the other government operations that could potentially be impacted. And it's really unclear, to what extent the government will be able to prioritize essential services. I'd also flag air freight, the aviation system. It could be under real pressure in the event of a shutdown. In fact, in 2019, during the last extended government shutdown, it was the aviation system that eventually ended up proving the biggest pressure point, because you had both air traffic controllers and also TSA affected, and their ability to screen ended up being sort of the key political choke point that finally forced the sides in Congress back to the table to get the deal done.
And of course, air traffic controllers are already a very, very stressed industry when it comes to labor there. We know that for sure. Let's take a little bit of a pivot from the broader conversation about what's going on in Washington to looking specifically at what the FMCSA is working on right now. We've had them come out with a couple of rulemakings, a couple of proposed rulemakings, which kind of make some adjustments to the way that drivers could operate in the United States here these last few weeks or so. Let's go ahead and break down those. What are some of your thoughts on what's coming out of the FMCSA?
Sure, and I'd encourage everyone to think about the next 4 or 5 months as being sort of the crunch time for FMCSA. The way that regulatory policy works during a presidential administration is you kind of run into a deadline around April or May of a presidential election year. And so all of the hot work streams that FMCSA and really the entire executive branch have been working on, they need to get those done over the next few months. And so a lot of the high priority rulemakings that the Biden administration has been developing are going to come out over this next 6-month period. And I think we're looking at the speed limiter rule for FMCSA. We're looking at liability requirements for trucking companies and brokers. And then also the Department of Labor is engaged too with their rule on independent contractors. And so we're keeping a close eye on that one as well.
Lots of things going on with legislation, and we're going to move on now to my next topic. That was the word of top of mind, litigation. Of course, we saw rulings come out about broker carrier liability that we just mentioned when it comes to C.H. Robinson, and we've seen some other rulings come out as well. Everybody's wondering, are we going to see some of these cases eventually be tossed up to the Supreme Court here in the next few months or so? Do you think that that could be something that we watch as we move into the court's next session, is them take on maybe some of these cases of broker carrier responsibility and come out with maybe a true federal expectation or a federal standard that's set, precedent that's set, that would cover the differences in state legislation versus these federal cases?
Yeah, I think that we are going to see some key rulings from the Supreme Court over the next year or two. I think that the Supreme Court in particular tends to look at areas when you have a circuit split. And again, especially with the sort of ideological, split between right and left, you end up with the circuit court in, a more liberal circuit, ruling one way very differently from, a circuit court ruling in the other, in a more conservative area. And so, that's when the Supreme Court tends to be more likely to step in, when you have different circuit courts basically almost setting rules that are very different for different regions of the country. And then the Supreme Court is more inclined to sort it out. Specifically on the question of state rules that you mentioned, I think that the Supreme Court is going to have a few issues where the states, in particular, in California, has been sort of top of mind in this area, are setting rules on trucking where the industry is asking the Supreme Court to make a rule to avoid a patchwork situation. Industries tend to have a horror of having a patchwork because it makes things less efficient, because you have to have different, operating models in different parts of the country, and it just challenges efficiency. And so I think the Supreme Court has generally been sympathetic to those things when it comes to, industry operations that are more interstate.
So, Loren, to kind of wrap this up, as we've only got about a minute and a half left, anything that really comes to your mind as like a big concern for an immediate or imminent threat to the freight industry for what's going on in Washington? Is it really just that appropriations bill and whether things get passed or not that's going to be the biggest threat? Or are there other things that concern you heading into the end of this year and the start of 2024?
Well, the persistent inflation, I think, is really what's behind a lot of the labor unrest that we've seen in a lot of areas. And so, is specifically Washington, what is Washington's response going to be to the continued labor unrest, specifically if the UAW strike continues? We've already seen it expand again over the past week. So, is the White House going to get involved there on the labor strike side? And again, I think what's behind a lot of this is inflation. And so how are policymakers confronting that? That's probably the biggest threat to, continued economic recovery.
Absolutely. And you just ask any general consumer, and I bet that they would say the exact same thing. Thank you for joining us for today's Roundtable. Of course, we love hearing your perspective, and we will catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Kaylee.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take one final break. We'll be back to wrap up your show right after this.